1933 marks the beginning of the darkest chapter in German history. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party assume power in Germany. Since that time, the image of Germany and the Germans in the world has changed, and the shadows of the past are omnipresent even today.
Hitler was not an ordinary politician. Right from the start, he felt that the German people had to be redeemed.
Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. Once the Nazis take over the fates of Germany, they hold on to power until the downfall on the 8th of May 1945. Hitler's rule begins with great hopes and unprecedented jubilation.
What was unique about the Third Reich was that it brought about the most profound destruction of civilization that's ever been encountered, and this was because the Third Reich set out to destroy the values which had existed for 2,000 years, values associated with Judeo-Christian civilization, that this was a revolutionary attempt to upturn those values.
The way the totalitarian regime takes control of the entire nation within a few years is unprecedented. The Nazi government corrupts the new national community with an uncovered check drawn on the future.
From day one, this regime unscrupulously encumbered the state with debts for the sake of short-term political success. Basically, it was fatally flawed all along.
Hitler cannot assert his power without war. His vision is to rule the entire world. His hatred of Jews knows no limits. Jewish citizens are ostracized from the national community, persecuted and ultimately methodically murdered in death factories.
The entire National Socialist history is about radicalizations. They only hazarded one step at a time, and then another, and another. And in wartime, it's a lot easier to enforce radical measures.
Film footage, not associated with the Nazi propaganda, documents the horrors of war and the atrocities committed. The Germans subjugate half the European continent and systematically loot the defeated countries. Only the determination of the Allies to put an end to this aggression stops the war of annihilation. Millions of German soldiers become the victims of the dictator's hubris. The sensational early successes make Hitler believe he is infallible, and for a long time the Germans have faith in him.
Hitler himself, it could not be concealed, had actually stood behind this German defeat in Stalingrad. And so for the first time now, the German population blamed Hitler personally.
The legacy of Hitler's regime is 60 million dead. The crimes against humanity in Auschwitz, the Holocaust of 6 million European Jews, shake the foundations of civilization. But only few offer resistance. And not even when Allied air raids lay one city after another in ashes do the Germans rebel against the Nazi regime. Faith in the final victory may dwindle, but the home front remains unruffled.
I think that the whole thing is held together by the fear of defeat, a tremendous fear, which is also based to some extent on knowledge about the atrocities.
After Hitler's suicide and the Wehrmacht's capitulation, images of the crimes committed in the name of Germany travel around the world. People are aghast at the realization that the history of their country will be forever tainted with genocide. At the end of the era of the Third Reich, the hopes of the German people are buried under the rubble. After 12 years of barbaric rule, only the wildest optimists believe in a happy future for the country. In the spring of 1933, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda stages a march by members of the stormtroopers at the Brandenburg Gate with a film camera. The resulting motion picture reenacts the night in which Hitler assumed power in Germany. The Third Reich is only a few months old, and already the Nazi leaders are beginning to glorify their own history. On the morning of the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler leaves Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin among a cheering crowd of supporters. At 11 o'clock, he is to be appointed Chancellor of Germany by Reich President von Hindenburg. This day will become a turning point in the history of the 20th century. Franz von Papen is at Hitler's side during the presentation of the new cabinet. The National Conservative Vice-Chancellor believes he can keep Hitler in check and maintains, "We've hired him."
Hitler didn't have any blueprint in mind at that time. His main ideas were to get new elections, following the elections to have an enabling act, and to acquire power in the various Länder, in the various states like Bavaria and Saxony, and finally, of course, obviously to destroy his internal enemies. I think those were the main points that Hitler had in mind when he took power in 1933. Beyond that, no clear idea of how things would develop.
To celebrate Hitler's appointment, gangs of the stormtroopers march through the Brandenburg Gate and into Berlin's government district in the evening. Reich President von Hindenburg can be seen as a faint silhouette at the window. A journalist of the time prophetically comments that Hitler's appointment as Reich Chancellor equals a leap into darkness. Having been appointed the new Interior Minister of Prussia, Hermann Göring is in control of the police. Hitler's unscrupulous advocate is determined to exploit his power without mercy.
Ich werde mit eisernem Besen auskehren und alle diejenigen, die ausschließlich wegen ihrer roten oder schwarzen Gesinnung und zur Unterdrückung aller nationalen Bestrebungen in Amt und Würden sitzen, hinausfegen.
A re-election is scheduled for the 5th of March. On the 10th of February, the Nazis organize a political rally where they declare war on the communists. Hitler's appearance is filmed and screened in cinemas all over Germany.
He had this great love for the German people, and he managed to convey this skillfully in his speeches. People saw in him their redeemer, with virtually religious overtones. He was someone who was saying to them, "I know things are really bad for you, unemployment is very high, but you still have something special. You are members of the German people. And all the other peoples who are not German are not as worthy as you are."
Wir wollen nicht lügen und wollen nicht schwindeln. Ich habe deshalb es abgelehnt, jemals vor dieses Volk hinzutreten und billige Versprechungen zu geben. Es kann niemand hier gegen mich aufstehen und zeigen, dass ich je gesagt habe, der Wiederaufstieg Deutschlands sei nur eine Frage von wenigen Tagen. Immer und immer wieder predige ich, der Wiederaufstieg der deutschen Nation ist die Frage der Wiedergewinnung der inneren Kraft und Gesundheit des deutschen Volkes.
The democratic parties don't stand a chance against the Nazi rhetoric. The destruction of the Reichstag on the 27th of February 1933 signals the demise of the Weimar Republic. Hitler had been in power no more than 4 weeks when Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe sets the building on fire. The Reichstag is gutted by the flames. Hitler uses the opportunity to settle the score with his political opponents. An emergency decree suspends most civil liberties in Germany. The newspapers of the Communist and Social Democratic parties are banned and many functionaries arrested. The police are encouraged to use their weapons without hesitation against so-called subversive organizations and demonstrators. Nazi combat groups are given police powers. Working-class leaders who have just finished their speeches in front of huge audiences are driven out of the Union buildings by gangs of thugs. Hitler is hoping to win by a comfortable margin in the election and gain the majority in order to push through a dictatorial rule. Yet the Nazis only reach 44% of the votes and form a coalition with the National Conservative Party that gives them a narrow majority.
The Nazi Party was the first People's Party in Germany. It was not a party that represented a section of the population, as the political landscape was structured during the Weimar Republic, with parties representing the Catholics, the working class, or the industrialists. The Centre Party voters were Catholic, and the SPD voters were labourers. The dedicated Nazis were few and far between.
Das waren die überzeugten Nazis.
On the 21st of March 1933, Hitler's head of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, stages the opening ceremony for the new Reichstag in Potsdam to demonstrate reconciliation between the Nazi movement and the old Prussia. Hitler shuns the party uniform for a tailcoat and acts as a humble servant of the state. An observer comments, "He has undeniably grown."
21st of March 1933 was symbolically very important. Day was chosen as the first day. Originally, it was going to be the opening of the new Reichstag was going to be in April. They moved it to the 21st of March, being the symbolic day, the first day of spring, also the day on which Bismarck held the first Reichstag after the German unification of 1871. More importantly still, though, this was the moment at which old Prussia, came together with the new Germany. Everything was done, therefore, to represent the coming together of the old and the new, and this was the symbolic moment at which the old elites met up with the representatives of the new Germany, the Nazi leadership.
An amateur filmmaker from Marburg documents the day of Potsdam with his camera. On his way to the Garrison Church, Reich President von Hindenburg inspects the guards of honor from the army and the stormtroopers. At the tomb of Friedrich the Great, von Hindenburg, as the representative of the old era, and Hitler as the herald of the new age, demonstrate unanimity. The old man willingly lets himself be used by the propaganda. The Social Democrats do not attend the staged event. 2 days later, they are the only party in the Reichstag to vote against Hitler's Enabling Act, which will systematically strip Germany of the last remnants of democracy. Stormtroopers and police hunt down Social Democrat and Communist functionaries. Thousands are murdered or interned in so-called protective custody camps. This film from a camp in Halle is shown in local cinemas as a deterrent. Berlin, the 1st of April 1933, the day on which the brutality of the new era manifests itself openly for the first time. Hitler's cabinet has called for a countrywide boycott of Jewish shops.
The actual boycott was a shock for Germans. It all happened out of the blue. One day, people in uniform were standing outside the shops and wouldn't let anybody in. It was an overt message to the Jewish citizens all over Germany that they couldn't be part of the national community because they belong to another race or don't have the right ancestry.
Contrary to the claims of the propaganda machinery, the boycott is not particularly successful. Many customers simply ignore the posters and signs of the stormtroopers. For German Jews, however, the day will become a traumatic memory.
In Berlin, wie in anderen Universitätsstädten Deutschlands, wurden undeutsche und unsittliche Bücher von den Studenten eingesammelt und öffentlich verbrannt. Der Scheiterhaufen auf dem Opernplatz in Berlin.
Berlin's Opernplatz stands as a symbol for Germany's Christian and humanistic traditions. Now it becomes the venue of the burning of 20,000 books. The new Minister for Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, addresses the youth.
Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein. Und dazu wollen wir euch erziehen. Und deshalb tut ihr gut daran, diese mitternächtige Stunde den Ungeist der Vergangenheit den Flammen anzuvertrauen.
Heinrich Heine had written, "Wherever they burn books, in the end, they will also burn human beings."
They stigmatized those who were a threat to the nation, including authors who had written immoral things and so on. We are healthy, and we want to be a healthy society, they said. So we don't need these subversive elements.
The massive enlistments into the Nazi Party are no propaganda fabrication. A cameraman in Halle documents how popular it has meanwhile become to apply for membership to the NSDAP. Even a significant number of communists are happy to convert. By the 1st of May 1933, 1.6 million Germans will have joined the Nazi Party. Hitler proclaims the 1st of May a national holiday, thus satisfying an old demand of the labor unions. Goebbels stages the appearance of the Führer on Berlin's Tempelhof airfield, designed to have an all-encompassing effect.
Ist nicht mehr das Volk der Ehrlosigkeit, der Schande, der Selbstabfleischung, der Gleichmütigkeit und Kleingläubigkeit. Nein, Herr, das deutsche Volk ist wieder stark geworden in seinem Geiste, stark in seinem Willen, stark in seiner Beharrlichkeit, stark im Ertragen aller Opfer. Herr, wir lassen mich von dir.
For the first time, Adolf Hitler is visually presented as the shining light of the new folk community. On the following day, the last remaining democratic labor organizations in Germany are done away with.
Ein Arbeiter in der Weimarer Republik.
A laborer during the Weimar Republic didn't know what holiday was. By the end of the Third Reich, every worker had a legal right to 14 days vacation a year. It was something that was introduced then, along with other elements contributing to leisure time and enjoyment of life in general, things that didn't exist before.
Von Veränderung, die es vorher nicht gegeben hat.
In the eyes of the Germans, the credit for all this was due to their Führer.
Ihres Führers, dass sie das hatten.
In the face of 6 million jobless Germans, Hitler leads the population to believe that mass unemployment can be combated through the construction of autobahns and other costly economy-stimulating measures. Those who appear unimpressed by the spirit of optimism or offer resistance to the dictatorship are mercilessly persecuted by Hitler's henchmen. Hermann Göring has one of the first so-called re-education centers built in Oranienburg near Berlin. Unlike the Nazi propaganda suggests, people there are tortured and murdered with his consent. In Prussia alone, over 25,000 people are interned in camps. As of the 26th of April 1933, Göring augments the coercive apparatus of the Nazis with the establishment of the Gestapo, secret state police. Despite the fact that all opposition parties have been banned, spontaneous labor strikes do take place occasionally, but are quickly suppressed. On the 11th of November 1933, Joseph Goebbels organizes Hitler's appearance in Siemensstadt, in the north of Berlin, as a demonstration for the labor force. Rapturous cheering, he writes in his diary. All of Germany is standing still. A year ago, they would have beaten us to death. Hitler knows his speech is transmitted on the radio and in public places. The newsreel is there too. Siemensstadt becomes one of the highlights in the Nazis' process of enforced conformity.
Wir haben nun gearbeitet und wir haben in diesen 9 Monaten Ungeheuerliches erreicht. Vielleicht wird manch unter Ihnen sein, der es mir nicht verzeihen kann, dass ich die marxistischen Parteien vernichtete. Aber mein Freund, ich habe die anderen genauso vernichtet. Sie sind
In less than 1 year, Adolf Hitler has consolidated his power in Germany, using the dictatorial powers he was granted and terrorizing measures, but also with the active help of the majority of the Germans. Hitler had to persuade the labor force that National Socialism would secure their future. Many farmers, on the other hand, had counted among the Nazis' most fervent supporters even before 1933.
Fast alle deutschen Bauern waren überschuldet.
The vast majority of farmers in Germany were heavily indebted at that time. But by early 1945, not one of them was in debt any longer. A new system of social security and income guarantee for farmers was introduced in Germany in 1933, with crop prices being subsidized by the state. However, in my view, this relationship, this association between the people and the leadership, was effectively a speculation bubble. A lot of money was pumped into agriculture, which was supposed to come back into the coffers in the future, but this wasn't possible because it was too much.
Aber gar nicht kann, weil es zu viel ist.
The Nazi regime tries to captivate the people through a series of job creation schemes. Approximately 1 billion Reichsmarks are appropriated for the promotion of national labor. Over 80,000 men are soon given jobs in Autobahn construction alone. Tax relief in favor of the common people is an additional burden to the treasury.
Starke Schultern.
Strong shoulders should carry a heavy load. Weak shoulders should be spared. National debt was not an issue at the time. One of Hitler's first measures was to put a stop to the publishing of the Reich budget for 1934 and subsequently, which means that the budget became a secret internal matter. No one spoke to the public about debt, and there was no mention of it in newspapers either. The public was unaware.
Darüber stand nichts in der Zeitung, das gab es nicht.
The economic recovery is very slow to materialize. The number of unemployed only drops to about 4 million, but the propaganda succeeds in presenting the government's measures as a successful emergence into a new era in which the country, self-confident and modern, will be able to stand on its own feet. So on the 1st of May 1934, crowds of people flood open-air areas all over Germany to listen to the broadcast of Hitler's speech on the Day of National Labor. The footage here is from the Thingstedner Halle, an outdoor amphitheater designed on the format of ancient Germanic models. In Berlin's Lustgarten, the Reich Chancellor proclaims his vision for the future of the nation before an audience of over 2 million people.
Was wir vom kommenden Deutschland ersehnen und erwarten, das müsst ihr, meine Jungen und Mädchen, erfüllen.
During the first year of his rule, Hitler has paid little attention to foreign politics. But now the revision of the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, which was imposed upon the Germans after the end of the First World War, becomes one of his priorities. For 15 years, the Saarland had been under the administration of the League of Nations. Now its status is to be determined by means of a plebiscite. Pro-unification demonstrations are organized all over Germany, such as here at the Monument to the Battle of Nations in Leipzig. For the city's conservative mayor, Karl Goerdeler, the matter is a national duty. The Saar issue presents the Nazis with a welcome opportunity to demonstrate the unity and the strength of the German people. Another key objective of the Nazi regime is the Gleichschaltung, or forced coordination of youth. Through a combination of campsite romanticism, marching exercises and cowboy and Indian games, boys and girls become acquainted with National Socialism in summer camps. For the Hitler boys, the military drill starts at a very early age. The party youth must be tough as leather, swift as the greyhound, and hard as Krupp steel. Their trademarks are brown shirts and neckties. By 1934, the Hitler Youth already counts 1.2 million members.
Uniformen haben einen wesentlichen sozialen.
Essentially, uniforms serve a social purpose. Everyone looks the same, so one can't tell if a child comes from a rich or a poor family, whether one can or can't afford expensive clothes and shoes.
Das wird dadurch überwunden.
This principle of egalitarianism, both in terms of appearance, but also with respect to equal opportunities, was also propagated by Hitler himself.
Auch zunächst mal äußerlicher Gleichheit, die dann eben auch Chancengleichheit ist.
And he saw himself as a role model in that sense.
Drauf ankommt. Und er selber war ein Vorbild. Aus welchen Verhältnissen man.
He believed that the factors that determine the development of a person were not the social background one came from, but one's capability and competence.
In der Zukunft entscheiden sollte und niemals das.
In other words, that whether a child is born with a silver spoon in his mouth or not does not matter as regards his later development.
Silbernen Löffel im Mund geboren worden ist oder nicht.
The stormtroopers are a state within the state in Nazi Germany. The ambitious plans of Ernst Röhm, commander of the stormtroopers, have started to become a threat for Hitler's powers. The conservatives are warning of a perpetual rebellion from below, and the military leaders are afraid of the growing power of their direct rivals. Hitler decides to eliminate the risk by force. In late June 1934, he has Röhm and other leaders of the stormtroopers arrested and executed.
Hitler, for months and months, to the irritation of Goebbels and many others, did little to challenge this. And it seemed as though Hitler was very hesitant, wouldn't act at all, until it came to the end of June 1934. And after months of hesitancy, Hitler did act, and when he did act, then with utter brutality in destroying the leadership of the SR, of the stormtroopers, and thereby in putting himself on the side of the army. He had to destroy his own paramilitary unit in order to side with the force that was really crucial to him, which was that of the army.
Shortly afterwards, Hitler travels to Bayreuth to visit Winifred Wagner, who had been Röhm's friend since the early days of the movement. Remaining cool and self-assured during their private talk, he justifies the purge to her, arguing that in the end, only 77 people had been executed. Charlemagne, too, had had to slay the rebellious Saxons before he set the foundations for his empire, but as everyone knows, was later canonized. His own acts were all based on the principle that everything that was of service to the German people was good, Hitler tells her. By the end of their relaxed conversation, Richard Wagner's daughter-in-law was persuaded of Röhm's disloyalty.
Winifred Wagner was the ideal person for the Redeemer image they wanted to project, being the successor of composer Richard Wagner, of whom Hitler was a great fan. The two of them appearing together at the Bayreuth Festival before the performers and the other Wagnerians was a demonstration of Hitler's elevation to a different social class.
Each summer, Bayreuth becomes the cultural center of the Third Reich. Everybody who considers themselves important in Nazi Germany journeys to the Richard Wagner Festspiele, whether they are Wagner fans or not. Wolfgang Wagner, the composer's grandson, captures the arrival of the guests with his private camera. Before the performance, Hitler is seen by the window with another grandson, Wieland. After Ernst Röhm's execution, the role of his stormtroopers in Bayreuth, as in the entire Third Reich, is more or less decorative. Here, Wieland and Wolfgang Wagner are marching at the front of a parade of the stormtroopers before the festival theater. On the 2nd of August 1934, Reich President von Hindenburg dies at the age of 86. The coffin is transported to the East Prussian town of Tannenberg, where it is interred in a pompous funeral ceremony. Without delay, Hitler does away with the official position.
this was a critical period for Hitler, naturally. And it was important, therefore, to build up the image of Hitler as the symbol of national unity, in particular after just what had happened. So on Hindenburg's death, then he takes over, becomes then the head of state. An oath of allegiance is sworn to him, which is then, the oath of allegiance, interestingly enough, is suggested not by Hitler himself, but by the Reichswehr minister von Blomberg.
From now on, Hitler is the Führer and Chancellor of all Germans. A plebiscite on the 19th of August approves Hitler's merger of presidency and chancellorship. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda campaign had attuned the German people to the plebiscite. In spite of the massive manipulation and the unconcealed pressure, 10% of the electorate withhold their approval. The other 90% consent to the Führer's holding unrestricted powers. It is only now that Hitler has attained his goal. No one can stop him, and most Germans hail him wholeheartedly. Hitler's megalomania is also evident in his plans for the reshaping of Germany's cities. Construction work for the monumental expansion of the Nazi Party rallying grounds in Nuremberg has been expedited since the Nazis seized power. Hitler frequently shows up to inspect the progress himself, accompanied by Franconia's Gauleiter Julius Streicher, Germany's most fanatic anti-Semitist. Hitler, a would-be architect, has specific ideas for the vast grounds. Nuremberg, a symbol of the First German Reich with its half-timbered houses and Gothic churches, is the perfect location to celebrate Hitler's self-aggrandizement to an absolute ruler. The cult around the Führer will find its cinematic over-glorification some weeks later in a film that characterizes the image of the Third Reich to this day. Actress and director Leni Riefenstahl had been personally commissioned by Hitler to document the Nuremberg Party rally in 1934. In the film Triumph of the Will, the talented filmmaker monumentalizes Hitler in a way that transfigures the Nazi propaganda.
The film Triumph of the Will, then, at the party rally of since September 1934, is a celluloid depiction of the Führer cult. So it represents Hitler towering above the party, towering above the state, and representing Germany. And to this extent, this film, unlike the predecessor of the year before, which has been much more a film about the party, this film is about Hitler, and everybody else there is reduced more as to supernumeraries on the stage, as Hitler represents the symbol of the new Germany.
Triumph of the Will becomes a box office hit all across Germany's cinemas and contributes significantly to the idolization of the dictator.
It was something like a religious delusion, but after all he was successful, and having this film made proved his good instincts. He really felt he was special. He was, after all, the Führer, and truly believed that it was his mission to redeem the nation and to save the Germans.
On the morning of New Year's Day, Adolf Hitler greets army and units of the stormtroopers in the court of the Chancellery. Germany's resurgence, he proclaims, will continue inexorably in the new year. The first step towards the end is the Saar plebiscite on the 13th of January. During the period preceding the referendum, Joseph Goebbels pulls out all the stops of National Socialist propaganda. But the opponents of Saarland's unification with Germany are also very active. In the end, an overwhelming majority of the population votes in favor of returning home to the Reich. For mainly economic reasons, over 90% choose the Nazi regime.
The Saar plebiscite was just a lucky break for Hitler. The Saarland was an area which was heavily Catholic and had a big working class component. So the two groups that had been mostly resistant towards the allures of National Socialism in the run-up to power in Germany dominated the area which is now the subject of the plebiscite. When the results of the plebiscite came out, the vote to return to Germany was just under 91%, which was a phenomenal result for the Nazi leadership, a brilliant achievement of propaganda there as well. But it meant now that this was a legitimation for Hitler, both internally, but also more importantly, externally in the eyes of the world outside. Hitler had now achieved this great result. He was popular even in an area which had the alternative choices in front of it.
The official ceremony of the reunion of the Saar territory with Nazi Germany takes place on the 1st of March 1935, and Hitler knows how to stage his first major foreign policy success for maximum propaganda effect. He proclaims in Saarbrücken that he is overjoyed and hopes that relations to the French neighbor will improve from now on. The Nazi regime cunningly manages to conceal its true intentions from the international community while pressing its demands at the same time. This is also the case during the visit of a British delegation to Berlin that fruitlessly negotiates disarmament issues with the Nazis. Britain and France have been unyielding to Hitler's demands to rearm the country, and Germany's withdrawal from the League of Nations has aggravated the situation. Ever since they seized power, the Nazis have been secretly rearming Germany, ignoring the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Pocket battleship Deutschland has no reason to hide. With her 10,000 tons displacement, she is just within the allowed weight limit for a German naval vessel, according to the treaty stipulations. With their presence during a fleet maneuver, Hitler and Goering demonstrate the claim to power of a militarily re-strengthened Germany. Soon afterwards, the Nazis publicly declare Germany's rearmament.
Rearmament had been continuing in secret, and under the Versailles stipulations, Germany was only allowed an army of 100,000. Now the new confidence enabled Hitler to take the steps which would have been taken eventually anyway, to rush forward the announcement of that a German Luftwaffe existed, and also to introduce in March 1935 the general conscription, which was a complete breach of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler used a British white paper which had announced alterations in British rearmament because of the recognition of secret German rearmament then. Hitler used that as an affront, that this was an excuse to bring this forward, and also the fact that the French had extended conscription in their own country from 1 year to 2 years. So these were plainly excuses from Hitler's side, but nonetheless they served then to bring forward the announcement of a German air force, and then the announcement of general conscription, to the great applause of the population within Germany, who were very proud of the fact that this had been done, but yet again another nail in the coffin of Versailles.
For the last 15 years, the Reichswehr had been an army of volunteers, limited to a number of 100,000 men. Now many German cities get to have their own garrison again. In the town of Wismar, the event is celebrated with a parade. In a newsreel appearance, Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring summons Germany's newfound self-confidence.
Dessen Gemeinschaftsidee stark genug ist,
in jedem einzelnen Volksgenossen den Willen zum restlosen Aufgeben in der Gemeinschaft bis zur Selbstaufopferung zu entfachen und zu bewahren. Auf dem starken Fundament der nationalsozialistischen Weltanschauung erhebt sich heute wieder festgefügt die deutsche Wehrgemeinschaft. Die Kluft, die im deutschen Volke aufgerissen war, hat der Führer geschlossen und in dem Schmelztiegel der Idee hineingeworfen, was auseinanderstrebte und gegeneinander stand. Die Parteien, die Klassen, die Stände, die Konfessionen.
Hermann Göring had become the embodiment of the unity between party, state and army leadership in the Third Reich.
Göring was Hitler's opposite physically, and all the more so when he became bigger and flabbier. Not to mention his wearing makeup and all his regalia. Whenever they stood next to each other, Hitler would always look much better. And this was especially noticeable at Göring's wedding in Berlin.
Vor allem bei der Hochzeit von Göring in Berlin.
The pomp of the ceremony was unbelievable. Hitler was best man, and on the film of the wedding, he can be seen standing next to the couple, looking rather plain and unpretentious. But he didn't need the glamour. He was Hitler, the Redeemer.
War ja Hitler der Erlöser.
In April 1935, Göring leads actress Emmy Sonnemann to the altar. All that remains for him now is either the throne or the gallows, the British ambassador mocks. Rare amateur footage shows Hitler on his birthday on the 20th of April 1935. Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal pilot, is one of few people who were allowed to film the dictator on private occasions. After his arrival in Wiesbaden, Hitler inspects a parade of stormtroopers as well as of Army, Navy and Air Force units. Hans Bauer is there with his camera too. Hermann Göring is undisputably the second in command in Nazi Germany. A fact that only few people know is that at the end of 1934, Hitler had appointed him his successor in a secret decree. For the cheering national community, the Führer is irreplaceable. Even a dictator can allow himself some leisure time. At least, this is what the film Days of Recreation for the Führer suggests. The National Comrades can buy it in shops, a clever way for Pilot Bauer to supplement his wage. A beaming child's face and all troubles are forgotten reads the intertitle to this scene. Then the small party makes its way to Wiesbaden's thermal springs. Hitler has every reason to be cheerful. As Führer and Chancellor of the Third Reich, he can make all the important decisions. It is not clear how absolute his power really is at that time and to what extent his paladins can influence it. On the 20th of July 1935, Hitler pays another visit to the construction site of the party rallying grounds in Nuremberg. He is accompanied by architect Albert Speer, whom the dictator has chosen to be the executor of his megalomaniac plans. He is to erect buildings such as have not been seen for thousands of years. Hitler explains to his architect that he wants his buildings to transmit his time and its spirit to posterity. Ultimately, all that remains to remind men of the great epochs of history is their monumental architecture, he remarks. Speer lets his Führer have his way and promises to build structures which, even in a state of decay, would resemble ancient models. The unemployment figures continue to decline thanks to state-subsidized construction projects, which cause expenditure for unemployment benefits to be cut down. Yet, all showcase projects in the Third Reich, such as the construction of autobahns, are financed by the fast-growing national debt. The first completed autobahn section near Frankfurt is open to traffic by the Führer himself. In the following years, too, Hitler does not miss the opportunity to attend such ceremonies in person. District Appeal of National Socialist Organizations in Merseburg on the 25th of August, 1935. In the presence of Gauleiter Rudolf Jordan, the brown-shirted German population proudly appears in public. The Third Reich has removed most social barriers. The snobbery of the old elites is now a thing of the past. Amidst the festivities, the anti-Semitic attitude of the new era is openly displayed as a matter of course. A Jew and a louse are like the plague in the house, reads one of the banners. People read Julius Streicher's hate paper, Der Stürmer, and support the slogan, anyone who buys from a Jew is a traitor to the people.
Der Rassismus, die Lehre vom Herrenmensch.
Part of the theory of the master race and racism in general is obviously the contempt for the others, the so-called subhumans. For the members of the master race themselves, however, this means something entirely different. It means social equality within the race. So for people with German blood, because they belong to the master race, the social differences are much less pronounced.
The isolation of Jews from all aspects of society has been systematically pushed through with Hitler's consent since 1935. The so-called Aryan laws affect civil servants, scholars, journalists, as well as soldiers. On the 10th of September 1935, Hitler travels to Nuremberg for the annual party congress. The party elite has been urging him to enact racial laws, ostracizing Jews once and for all from the national community. Head of SS Heinrich Himmler is fanatically anti-Semitic, and he is the one who will set the annihilation of European Jews in motion for his Führer.
Unser Führer, dem Retter und Schöpfer, Sieg heil! Sieg heil! Sieg heil!
Ich schlage nun dem Reichstag die Annahme der Gesetze vor, die Ihnen Parteigenosse Reichstagspräsident Göring verlesen wird.
Hitler leaves it to Hermann Göring to promulgate the new laws during an extraordinary session of the Reichstag.
Reichsbürger ist nur der Staatsangehörige deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes, der durch sein Verhalten beweist, dass er gewillt und geeignet ist, in Treue dem deutschen Volk und Reich zu dienen. Eheschließungen zwischen Juden und Staatsangehörigen deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes sind verboten.
The Nuremberg laws can now be instrumentalized by Hitler and his henchmen, providing legal grounds for the public discrimination of Jews. Week after week, the propaganda newspaper Der Stürmer prints lists of names of people who have been arrested. The Germans become a nation of informers. So-called race defilers are reported to the authorities.
What was being prepared gradually before became very definite after the enactment of the Nuremberg laws in 1935. The Germans were citizens of the Reich, and all others, especially the Jews, but also Poles and so on, were not Germans, and consequently not Reich citizens. This division between Germans and non-Germans was methodically carried through from the very beginning to the end.
Ganz pragmatisch bis zum Ende durchgezogen.